something. It turned out it was different. Now we have better information. We want the American people to be aware that we're refining our views. They never seemed to do that. The one time really it happened was, and to my surprise actually, came when there was the admission in 2003 and 2004 that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I had suspected someone would plant something somewhere and say, "See, we found it." But to my shock, the U.S. government in that case, there must have been some honest people left inside the CIA or wherever they were doing the investigations who said, "We just can't continue this lie. We have to tell the truth." And so they did. They said, they grudgingly kind of admitted that this claim had been false. But so even in that case where the U.S. government retracts the falsehoods that it had made and that Fred Hyatt and the rest of these folks at the Washington Post had promoted, there was more accountability inside the U.S. government than there was inside the press corps. And
well, because, Robbie, because you have to understand, and I'm sure you do, maybe some of the people listening don't understand, because at that point, we were, according to the U.S. foreign policy, we were liberating the people from the gangster Hussein. So we were doing a good deed. So, we kind of fudged it to do our good deed. But that's what the public was sold. There was a good deed to liberate the people of Iraq. And that has to do with what you're saying, I think, So
you think there was, because they could come up with a different explanation after the fact, they could drop the previous excuse. Is that what you're saying?
It didn't matter. It didn't matter because the ends justify the means. That's the
I think
US.
that often is the way they assume it's going to work. Is that if something's successful, what also happened with the Iraq War was it was not successful. Often, if there's a lie told to justify starting something, and it turns out to be a raving success, then or is perceived to be such by the American public, then there really is no need to go back and look at how the falsehood that got it going. There is that idea that yes, the ends justify the means, but in the case of the Iraq War, I think what happened with it was it soured pretty quickly, and it didn't work the way that it had been promised. There weren't candy when flowers were not thrown at the American troops. Instead, they were hit with IEDs and suicide bombers. Right. So you had this, which is, by the way, all very predictable going into this. And I even wrote a story in March of 2003 saying that the United States had lost the war in Iraq because it was clear that there was not going to be that happy ending that was being predicted. So so I think because of the sourness about the Iraq War, that there was this willingness to at least do some accountability. There probably was a certain amount inside the government of people saying we can't just continue lying about this, because I do think that does happen inside the government. Not everybody there is lockstep in going along with everything. That's, I think, a misnomer too. So you have this. But the point I'm making is that inside the U.S. press corps, there was literally or very little accountability. I guess you could say maybe Judy Miller did eventually get kicked out of the New York Times, but that was
got a great job at Fox. They got a great job at Fox.
Right, and so people land on their feet. And this is so the problem becomes that you don't have a system that works anymore. If you have a rewards and punishment system inside the press corps, really inside politics, inside government, that rewards the people who just play ball and go along, maybe be talented in certain ways, they're maybe gifted writers or they're kind of glib, that's what really counts. It's not that there isn't this sense that you can then fix the process by having those people weeded out and better people brought in. It works the opposite way. The good people are weeded out, and the corrupt people are essentially elevated. And promoted. So what happened in the 1980s, really, and this is why I think the 80s was an important period that we misunderstand. When you go from the 70s, where there was a bit more aggressiveness on the press corps' part, Watergate, Pentagon Papers, the My Lai massacre stories, things like that were being done in the 70s. When you get to the 80s under Reagan, we saw this kind of a Empire Strikes Back moment, and the press corps was very much whipped into line, and not just externally. There was also internally many of the publishers and the senior editors really shared Ronald Reagan's more aggressive view of how U.S. foreign policy should be applied around the world. There was a sense that America had been shamed by the Vietnam War, by the hostage crisis in Iran, that things were going kind of down. There were a lot of hippies and drug smoking and stuff like that happening, and so some of these older publishers and editors wanted to bring their reporters back into line and get them to be more supportive of U.S. foreign policy. So that's right. What I was seeing internally in these news organizations, very explicitly at Newsweek, which saw itself as more part of the elite media than, say, AP did, which was more of a middle class kind of news organization that wasn't as well connected at the social level of Washington. So, but what you'd see at a place like Newsweek would be these senior editors saying what's good for the country. We have to do what's good for the country, and that meant we shouldn't do stories that make America look bad, that make the U.S. government look bad. So there was hostility toward that, and so people who would play ball with that were moved up. And if you were like, in my situation, writing about Contra drug trafficking or writing about cover-ups in the going on inside the White House, which well, by the way, that turned out to be 100% true, that there was an effort there were orders given by senior White House officials in the beginning of the Iran-Contra scandal to protect Reagan, because the fear was that since he had been involved in the scandal, he might face impeachment. So so there was a rally around the president, throw some people over the side, cast the blame on Ollie North or Poindexter or McFarlane, but protect Reagan and George H.W. Bush, who was going to be the next, who was going to follow on as president. So you had this sort of you had that attitude, which was real, and it was ultimately confirmed. But in the meantime, it was not the kind of story that Newsweek really wanted. They wanted. Well,
I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question. How did they even hire you over in Newsweek? I mean, you went to Newsweek in '87. I mean, they knew of your history. Why would they hire you?
Well, the situation was that for most of that period, going like 85, 86, as I was writing about what became the Iran-Contra scandal, I was writing about different aspects of it. Newsweek was part of the effort to sort of knock down those stories, poo-poo them.
Right.
They had their writers who just were saying this isn't really a story, not really a story, right. And then it became a huge story. So Newsweek needed somebody with sources.
Oh, okay.
And this was also a feeling of the Washington Bureau at the time. They needed somebody who could actually get them something, and I was one of those people who could get them something. Now, so they hired me, and I perhaps should have not have taken the job. I was also being approached by some other news organizations. Time magazine was talking to me. The New York Times had been sort of interested, but because people were at that moment looking for someone who could fill in gaps, because they had all their key reporters were saying, they had been saying this wasn't a story, and then it obviously became a story. So there was this short-term interest, but then I kept pushing the story ahead, and it was something that that Newsweek was uncomfortable with. They didn't really want the story. They never wanted the story. So there was that period when they needed someone who could sort of get them the right sourcing to get into the game. But once they got into the game,
they didn't want to be in the game. Yeah,
they didn't want to be in the game, and they'd rather would be in the part of the game saying, "Oh, there's nothing here, nothing here." So the more I kept finding that there was more and more, and taking it further and further, they became more and more uncomfortable and even angry. I mean, when the Iran-Contra report was issued by Congress, which itself wasn't a particularly great report, but that came out in the fall of '87, I was specifically ordered by the bureau chief, Evan Thomas, under orders from New York not to read it. I was literally told, we are ordering you not to read the report.
Unbelievable.
And I said, well, I said, well, we have to write something on this because it's been the biggest story going. And then I was told, well, if there's something that isn't in the report that, maybe you could write about what's not in the report. And I said, well, how can I write about what's not in the report if I haven't read the report? It had gone to that level of anger and madness on the part of the senior editors. And then when Ollie North went on trial, which was another major story, really, in '89, Newsweek had a specific order from the top that we were not going to cover the trial. and at that point, because I knew I'd end up getting blamed because basically that was a big story and everyone else was covering it, but Newsweek was essentially boycotting it because they didn't want it to be a story.
Unbelievable.
But they couldn't really control that. So anyway, that's why I had to arrange through Federal News Service, which was a new thing at the time, doing transcripts, to get the daily transcripts of the trial because I was not allowed to go to it. And I'd get that at night every evening, and I would read through it. And from that, I was able to break some stories because what we got from the transcripts included the bench conferences. And so I could write stories about what the judge was saying to the different lawyers at the bench conferences, but they didn't want that either. So I would try to sneak those in through the Periscope section, which was this little brief section that they had at the beginning of the magazine. Anyway, so they got angrier and angrier when I kept advancing the story because they really wanted the story to go away, and ultimately they wanted me to go away. But
that's not a conspiracy theory.
That's
a conspiracy. That's just conspiracy. I mean, you have people that have power that control the people that run the media, and so that's horrible.
Well, I'm not sure I call it a conspiracy. I think it was a mindset. It was how, and also you have to remember that that Newsweek was then owned by the Washington Post, and the Washington Post was getting increasingly neoconservative in its outlook. Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of both Newsweek and the Washington Post, she really liked the Reagans. It was kind of a personal, social thing even. And so she didn't want the Reagans to look bad. She didn't want her publications to be out there tearing down the Reagans, and that's how it was viewed. And that even though I was just seeing it as I'm reporting a story, they were seeing it as, well, oh, this is going to hurt the Reagans or make the country look bad in the eyes of the world. It was kind of a twisted view of journalism that I never had encountered before. Really, I've encountered cowardice on the part of some AP executives and so forth, but this was something that was quite a bit different. But I'm not sure I'd say it was a conspiracy. I would just sort of say it was how they wanted a story to go a certain way for their various reasons, and they were upset that it didn't.
Okay, but let me ask you this. First of all, you make a point about people being rewarded around the time of the Iraq invasion. People in the media. And here's an interesting thing that a lot of people who are listening probably don't even realize. The guy who was the moderator of this ridiculous, which I'm going to ask you about in a minute, this ridiculous so-called debate between Trump and Clinton, he was a cheerleader. He was a cheerleader on MSNBC during the invasion, the run-up and the actual invasion of Iraq. Okay, Lester Holt was a cheerleader, reporter, or an anchor. He was a minor anchor at the time, and he was cheerleading all through the whole thing. It was like this was the greatest thing. They're having all the generals come on and the soldiers and all that stuff with the. And then he gets himself a promotion, becomes a major anchor, and then they even picked him to do the moderation of the actual debate. So it's interesting that what you're saying before is so true.
Well, yeah, I think basically if you think of all the journalists who did not act as journalists during that period, and what happened to them, the fact they basically are still there or got promoted. I mean, it's very hard to find. First of all, very few people, Wolf Blitzer or on CNN or the folks at MSNBC. Chris Matthews likes to talk about how he was a big opponent of the Iraq War. He's about it, sort of like Donald Trump. I guess maybe he thought it. I don't